So a very warm welcome, first of all, and I'd like to thank very warmly Royal Holloway, University of London, for generously supporting tonight's event, and of course our hosts, the Freud Museum. I'm very privileged to have been asked by Gill Rye, the lead editor of the volume we're launching tonight, Motherhood in Literature and Culture, to play a part in helping to shape its contents. Along with the co-editors Victoria Browne, Adalgisa Giorgio and Abigail Lee Six. So Gill is really the driving force behind the book and the network that gave rise to it. That is the Motherhood in Post-1968 European Literature Network, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So I'm going to hand over now to our chair tonight, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. And I think then she's going to give us the opportunity to introduce ourselves, the panel, more formally. So, Yasmin.
Thank you. It's really interesting that we're doing this now, because I was just thinking back how motherhood has changed and motherhood stays the same. So when I came here, I was just telling Lisa the story when I came from Uganda in 1972, and then I was pregnant 6 years later. This was the time of a different kind of feminism, and actually penetration was rape or betrayal, or whichever way you wanted to look at it. And I hid my pregnancy behind a vast pair of dungarees for an awfully long time, and it was bewildering because I'd come from a country where women were dying at birth in huge numbers in Uganda. And we've been through so many cycles since then. And one of the most interesting bits of work I did a few years ago was at Grenfell Tower with teenage mums, black and white. And what was very interesting then, and I really hope to God they weren't among the dead, how entitled and confident the black women, young teenage mothers I interviewed felt. And they used the services, and how the working class white teenage mums were intimidated by the services. So that's what I mean, that things changed and they stay the same. And I've really loved, I haven't read it from cover to cover, I've read a lot of this book. And my congratulations to the editors and the writers, because it's so accessible. Because too often academic writing is so obscure I can't understand it. And I think with motherhood, which is such a universal experience, it's lovely, and there are some delightful, lyrical, extraordinarily honest bits in the book, and if you haven't got it, please buy it. So I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves in some detail. There are some astonishing careers before you here, and then I'll get each panel member to talk about one aspect of the book. We've got Lisa here who did the foreword, so she'll talk about the foreword and the main things that she drew together, and what are the primary things the panelists want to highlight. I'll then ask them some follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. Is that all right? So can I start with you, Lisa? Do you want to use that or this?
Yeah, let's pass this along. So now you want me to introduce myself? I've got my own mic.
Oh, you've got your own mic. Lucky you.
So, can you hear me okay?
No.
No, okay, so I'll just talk louder, or I'll just use the mic. Yeah, all right, good. Now you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
All right, great. I get to be a pop star for a few minutes. All right, so I'm Lisa Baraitser. What should I say about myself? I'm a reader in psychosocial studies in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck at the University of London. I've been working for quite a long time trying to think about maternal subjectivity. We can think a bit about what that term means a bit later on if we want to. And I wrote a book in 2009 that's called Maternal Encounters, The Ethics of Interruption, which was an attempt to write a kind of auto-ethnographic account of motherhood at the same time as trying to build an account of maternal ethics. And around that time I got interested in the kind of shame or embarrassment really that motherhood made in the academy. lots of people study motherhood, but they do so in under the auspices of another disciplinary space, like, you know, they're working on literature, motherhood in literature, or they're working on parenting studies in sociology. But actually there are very few spaces constituted as spaces to study the maternal. There are no departments of maternal studies, for example. What clings to maternal studies is all sorts of anxieties in academia around essentialism. What do we mean by the maternal when we're not including the paternal? Why don't we talk about fathers and so on? So I got interested in what it might mean to set up an interdisciplinary space that might provide precisely that, a space to study the maternal. Including engaging with those issues of shame and embarrassment that cling to the maternal, and to try to think them through. So I set up a network, 2007 or something, called MAMSI, which stands for Mapping Maternal Subjectivities, Identities and Ethics, and a journal called Studies in the Maternal. And there are about 500 members worldwide. You're all very welcome to join. And we put on events and stimulate discussion and interactive sort of blog discussions and all sorts of ways of trying to talk about the maternal. So, and I've been working on time and care. I've just got a new book coming out called Enduring Time, where I've tried to extend some of my thinking about motherhood into a more general sort of account of the relationship between time, temporality and issues to do with care.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. So I'm Emily Jeremiah, and I'm Senior Lecturer in German and Gender Studies at Royal Holloway, University of London. And I'm the author of 3 books, Troubling Maternity, Nomadic Ethics and Willful Girls, which is forthcoming in January. So I'm consistently interested too in ethics and in gender and literature. And I'm also a translator of Finnish literature. And I work with my mother often, who is Finnish. And together we've translated, for example, a novel called White Hunger by Abigail Lee Six, which is longlisted for the Man Booker International. And in my chapter in the book, I talk about a novel by the British novelist Sarah Moss called Night Waking. And I draw on Lisa's fantastic work, influential work, to talk about interruption and about time precisely. The main character in that novel is interrupted often. She's an academic trying to write an academic book by her sons, and her husband is not. So the novel explores heterosexuality and the gendering of time and the privileging of male time over female time, and specifically maternal time and care. And I'm fascinated by ambivalence, which has been described as involving a mixture of loving and hating feelings towards one's child or children, and by the complexity and difficulty of care, which is routinely dismissed and sentimentalised, ignored, and by the labour and the effortfulness of mothering. And I think it is urgent and imperative to highlight those things, and profoundly political, in fact. And I think one of the things that the volume does, I hope, is highlight to the role of the arts and the humanities in opening those things up for discussion and making them clear, hopefully, to policymakers, what we can hope, and to the media, to journalists, to other constituencies beyond the academy, potentially.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Carolyn Jess-Cooke. I'm a poet, a novelist and an academic. I'm based at the University of Glasgow, and I'm here tonight not having played any part at all in this book, but another book called Writing Motherhood, which you might have seen outside on the table. It was there, I don't think it's there. It's gone missing.
Book stealing at the Freud Museum. Oh my God.
It'll show up. But that book was my 10th book. I've published a range of poetry collections and novels and academic texts as well. But this book, Writing Motherhood, was about a 7-year labour of love, and it really it sort of extended out of my own experiences, if you like, of being a maker of literature, a maker of text, but really confronting very sharply that that notion of the pram and the hallway and what that meant politically and personally. And how this affected other women writers as well, that there's this sort of, question that just was being asked of me all the time at any event I did as a novelist. How do you find time to write? All the time. And I thought, this is really interesting that this question is being asked, and it seemed to have layers to it. Actually, there was a layer of, I would chat with other women writers about, well, how do you find time and what's your sort of routine? And but then there's another layer of, we're being asked this all the time. There's this assumption that, I should just be not writing, that I should, be fully just with my kids all the time and therefore shouldn't be making texts. So this raised a lot of questions for me. And in 2013, I got Arts Council funding to take 20 female writers around 13 literary festivals to talk about this. And the things that came up in that conversation were immense, particularly with regards to publishing. So it's not just in terms of the act of writing that, it seems somewhat subversive for a woman to be writing, but in terms of publishing as well, that dreaded term chick lit just kept surfacing over and over again. And we discovered that, some very non-maternal subjects that were more relevant to women, more broadly, whether they had children or not. These subjects, when they were found to be in books, were packaged by the publishers with covers that featured teapots and wellies. And so what does that communicate about women's issues? It just seemed to me more and more that motherhood is a site of, wherein sexism is permissible. And how that affects the creation of literature, I think, is a very important topic. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. One of the things, I'm going back to what you've just said, that some of the most sort of irritating modern day topics or syndromes, if you like, is this quite cruel putting down of the mum's net has become a kind of shorthand for the spoiled middle-class mother who has nothing better to do than to worry. And then a book I actually thought was terrible, but and made a lot of money, far too much, but How Does She Do It? And by Alison Pearson. I don't know if any of you love that book. I apologise if you do, but it was all about exactly what you've said. The cupcakes, as if women are actually running around worrying about, will anybody know these cupcakes were bought from Marks and Spencer's, as if that's the kind of level of pettiness that we're all involved with. But I'm quite interested in the time element, which one way or another the three panellists have referred to. Has that not changed? I'm asking this as an open question, it's not my opinion. The whole idea of how much time a mother has to fulfill whatever it is that she wants to fulfill, has that not changed since the pram in the when was that written? Virginia Woolf wrote, how long ago was that?
No, that was
wasn't it Virginia?
Was it Cecil? Cecil someone in 1930, I think.
So has that not changed? Have those assumptions not changed? Carolyn, you seem to feel that some of the questioning and the conversations...
it's quite a broad question, I suppose, and in some ways I personally never felt, I always said that when I stood behind a pram, that first experience becoming a mother, that collision between the personal and the political was really strong, and I really felt sexist attitudes coming my way when I became a mother, particularly in terms of what I was writing about, that it wouldn't be taken seriously, and that was quite a shock. I didn't expect that.
So when are we talking about?
Well, 11 years ago, I suppose.
So quite recently.
Yeah, fairly recently. And, when I think of my own mother, I mean, I don't know, she didn't write, but I think in some ways we've kind of regressed, actually. There was a lot of things that I would discuss with her about motherhood, obviously, as you do, and she was kind of shocked, and she was like, it's getting harder, it's getting worse, you know, in regards to childcare and attitudes and the parenting police.
Yes.
But specifically with regards to mothers and how mothers are to blame for everything, was quite shocking. I just didn't expect that at all. So.
Emily, you said something quite interesting and important, I think, and it's timeless. The loving and hating.
Mm-hmm.
I'd really like you to develop that, because I think that's again something that seems to have gone back a long way and continues.
Yes, I mean, it is timeless, and I suppose one could say it is an unchanging feature, but it is also culturally specific or influenced by particular context, or sharpened perhaps by, for example, neoliberalism, if we're talking about the present. I don't think aided by a context in which this scrutiny seems only to be sharpening, if anything. So I don't know, I have trouble with this idea of timelessness, or I want to qualify it, that's my impulse, but so I don't know if I can do much with timelessness and universality.
I'm asking about the loving and hating.
The loving and the hating, yes, and that intensity and the anger, I think they are definitely worth exploring and investigating, and I think that's necessary. And I think what I was saying about the complexity and the difficulty, there's a quote from Adrienne Rich, we cite that in our introduction, and I think Adrienne Rich is a really important thinker and theorist. There's some nodding, and she's wonderful. Of Woman Born is a classic of motherhood studies. We talk about motherhood studies in our introduction as a discipline in its own right. Well, we're sort of saying it is, but we're having to say it is, aren't we, really, to perform that gesture. It's a performative gesture. Yes, it is. Motherhood studies does exist. We have made it exist. But yes, Adrienne Rich of Woman Born, a classic, 1975. But she writes there wonderfully and movingly and eloquently, a poet, of course. And yeah, I'd love us to come to poetry, and your poetry specifically, and your wonderful anthology. And we have poetry, of course, in our volume, Amaral, brilliantly translated, of course.
And you've got a wonderful chapter here on
ultrasound
poetry.
Exactly.
Ultrasound poetry, which is very... but the ultrasound thing, though, is irritatingly something that dads carry around in their pockets as well. Nothing wrong with that. It's great, we've got good new fathers, but it's very lovely to have words about them.
Yes, and precisely the chapter is arguing that ultrasound poetry is a way for the pregnant subject to assert herself against the scopic controlling gaze, or the potential of that, ultrasound to precisely flatten the fetus and the mother. So yes, the possibility of poetry to evoke complexity and then the interiority of the mother.
But the political point is an important one, because we are now living, like these women I interviewed, where the inequalities are so deep. They're so deep between those who are, okay in terms of income and possibilities, and those who are really losing it. And I did some work with Harriet Harman, where we looked at, this is about 3 years ago, we did a nationwide study of women in their 50s and how they felt about their lives. And what was so interesting and actually really painful was how many working class grandmoms in their 50s were now caught between having to look after the grandchildren because childcare is so expensive, and the women, because of the political program that women have to go out to work, mothers have to go out to work, they can't afford the childcare. So these mums, working class mothers, were having to look after the grandchildren and also their own parents. And so many of them were seriously, in terms of their health, suffering, emotional wrecks, and it really was a shock that here we are, supposedly living in times when some of feminism's aims have been achieved, but a political program, a particular deliberate political program, is punishing women in their 50s and the mums and all the rest of it. So the political point is a really important one. We don't talk about that enough. But Lisa, is there anything optimistic happening? Is there now? And I wanted you to please also explain what you mean. You said you would by your term
Maternal
subjectivities.
Is there anything optimistic? I think we're talking about a feminist history. I think what you said at the beginning, Yasmin, about thinking both historically. So you started with your own anecdote about a moment in feminism where you might have to feel that you had to hide a pregnancy under some dungarees in a feminist context, and thinking that might have moved on. And you also gave us an example of something that might cut across that feminist history, which is about social class. And I suppose that context of thinking about the place of the maternal as a sort of fulcrum through which feminism comes to encounter its own blind spots and its own difficulties with moving on is a really important one. So I think Angela McRobbie's work on the post-feminist contract and, really trying to think what happens for women who have dramatically entered the workforce in the post-war period, what happens to them as they hit motherhood, and the ways that suddenly all of the promises that come with a certain kind of equality that is linked with a certain kind of labour suddenly unravel, and that what happens then is that feminism is not available as a resource if it doesn't also include a discourse of maternity as itself a theoretically understood underpinning for how we might understand a female subject. And that's been the real battle, that somehow the feminine and the maternal are put at odds with one another.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that feminism struggles to incorporate and theorise. Julia Kristeva famously said, Western discourse does not have a theory of the maternal. Mm-hmm. So, and what does that mean? It has, in a way, a theory of matricide that founds the Western inaugural moment, the disappearance of the mother, if you like, or the figuration of the mother as a border territory, as she who gives form to life but can't take form herself. All of those old arguments, I think, are still completely relevant. And so when we talk about hopefulness, then I guess we have to think about it also in terms of what does the maternal as a figuration also propose about a temporality of the future. I mean, motherhood carries the temporality of the future, right? Supposedly. Mm. It is the place where you give birth to time. At the same time, we're living through a time where the future is dramatically foreclosed. Mm-hmm. That's part of our temporal imaginary at the moment, is that the future is not unfolding in the way that it was unfolding, potentially as a cultural imaginary in the post-war period, in which progress, the idea of what's going to come is going to be better than what we have now, as a formation is no longer functioning, I would say. So then you have to ask both what then does the maternal mean, if it's no longer a placeholder for the future, but also what can the maternal offer as a way to reimagine the idea of a future. So I think asking is there any hope that's a sociological question, if you like. There's always hope that we can change some elements of our social condition. But I think the question opens more broadly onto what it might mean that the maternal might figure as the ideal of hope.
Isn't one of the problems that the maternal has become consumerised and become part of the whole, you have a baby, you give birth, and the very next day you have to look as if you never were pregnant. The pernicious idea of perfection, the idea that anything you'd in a way, I felt my mother's generation in a way could be themselves and define themselves as far as possible, as long as they had some economic independence. Whereas now there is this whole, certainly the last decade, I think there's something happening on the consumerism of motherhood.
I think it's the mediatisation of motherhood, really, isn't it?
Really?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I was saying I think that's the mediatisation of motherhood as well as, you know, as capitalism and consumerism. But I think that the media has played a substantial role in defining motherhood and sort of taking away that subjectivity that you're mentioning. And, you know, just to speak to that a little bit more, it was very interesting the tensions that rose up with my tour, with Writing Motherhood tour, when we would go round. I remember someone on Facebook posted that it just sounded like a bunch of middle-class mothers moaning. And I thought immediately, wow, class is brought straight into that. How interesting. And, you know, people would ask frequently, well, why is it not writing parenthood? Why writing motherhood? And it was said in quite an angry way, actually. And I found that interesting and I think I hadn't expected that. But they wanted to know, you know, what about fathers, you know? But to me, it seemed very much about this idea about women reclaiming that subjectivity and defining motherhood, and maybe some people feeling uncomfortable with that definition. And I'm trying to think of the other thing that came up. Oh yes, again, this links into what you were saying about kind of pitting non-mothers against women with children, and you know, again and again it was brought up about this project kind of polarising women, and I thought, you know, no, we're talking about issues that are relevant to all women. This is about feminism, but you know, it was sort of seen as an uncomfortable kind of discussion that perhaps we were, you know, by talking about motherhood, you're suddenly pushing some women out of the room. So these were interesting discussions, I think, and to me pointed to a lot of the tensions between, well, not between, but around the maternal as a contested space.
As a stupidest student in the class, I still want to know what subjectivity is. Sorry.
Well, I guess in the history of Western philosophy, those who have been assigned a subject position tend to be those auto-effective male, separate, bounded entities that come to be seen and named as a subject. And I guess the whole issue about what happens when you bring the notion of the maternal into relation with the notion of a subject is that something gets disturbed around what a subject might mean, because I guess it is a very odd thing to understand that some subjects, let's call them women, are able to produce others, or to become two, or to become more than one. And that disturbs the whole foundation in some ways of the Western philosophical tradition. So I think for me, the place that mothers have been assigned as subjects traditionally has been that place of the disappearing subject, the cora, you know, the container, the one who gives rise to form. In psychoanalysis, for example, it's understood as an object rather than a subject, the maternal object. She who is there to be left, as Anna Furman famously said, probably in this house actually, a kind of disappearing subject, or the subject that needs to, by definition, be killed off in order for the infant to separate and to become a subject that is separate, bounded, freed from what Christeva called the clinging and caring mother. So that puts maternal subjects into what kind of subject then is the maternal subject other than a subject emptied out of subjectivity in order to give rise to this thing we call subjectivity. So that's an interesting
It's
paradox,
fascinating.
Yeah?
I'd never thought about that. Emily, you've talked about the politics and you've talked about you know, all the kind of deeper currents that are going on. But are we also now living in a time, for example, the things we took for granted, the choice of whether you wanted to be a mother or not, the choice of becoming maternal is now under savage threat. And so there is both a kind of now a duty. I don't know if you've seen this. I mean, you go to Mary Stopes or anywhere, and these ghastly people, including men and women, you know, I never thought I'd see that in this country. It's spreading, isn't it? And there is a pressure in our politics at the moment.
Indeed, you're right, and you're right. We took it for granted. We did.
The progress you talked about,
and I suppose that makes a volume such as this all the more urgent and timely, because we never thought this would happen. That's not something that the volume even addresses. I suppose we didn't even think.
But it just happened, didn't it? It kind of almost
just
just
as if it
happened.
has erupted.
Yeah.
And shockingly. If I may just come back to that question of class, and perhaps also just address some of the other issues that the volume addresses, if that's all right, because I do think class is deeply significant. It's come up more than once, but it does relate also to that question of time, because of course time is a privilege, isn't it? Having time, whose time, is worth something. You can pay, if you can pay for somebody to clean your house, fine, but if you can't, well, you're the one doing the cleaning, that's another matter, isn't it? So who can, afford to have time? Well, I suppose to write, but for example, a privilege, isn't it? Virginia Woolf wrote about that, didn't she? How many guineas you needed, I can't remember, but you needed a fair few, didn't you? But yes, class is immensely significant, of course. But other factors too that we address in our volume, I think, probably deserve at least a mention as we sit here, academics, most of us, or connected somehow to the academic realm. For example, disability, which is addressed in the volume importantly, the obscuring of disability, other sort of axes of difference such as sexuality, so Gill's chapter on lesbian mothering, and the difficulty of just self-assertion, self-definition, in the face of injurious norms, normativity. And yes, I think we can link that to neoliberalism, this ferocious neoliberalism, and that sort of those norms of parenting. And I think Ruth Kane's chapter is extremely important, actually, about a novella about a poor single mother. And I think that novella is extremely important if we can also talk a little bit about literature, because one of the driving contentions is to do with literature and the arts in making these issues urgent. The chapter by Ruth Kane brings literature into dialogue with law and with the media, which can be, doesn't have to be, but can be shrill and simplistic, and can ignore the nuanced realities of mothering, say. So literature can nuance debates about, for example, filicide and about poverty. So that novella Bord de Mer, I think, is Beside the Sea, is a really important one, and Ruth Kane's chapter is excellent, I think. So Adrienne Hunt is the translator, and the publisher's Pyrene Press. But yeah, I think there are so many factors that shape
the Rebecca bits, the bits about Rebecca and Daphne du Maurier. I think it's beautifully done, actually, the literature woven in with the kind of sociological, political analysis. I'm going to open it up to the audience, but I did want to mention that the race issue is also, or ethnicity. Yeah. I recently, a month ago, got to interview, because I was always very worried about, we're talking about these Muslim groomers who exploited white girls, and I wanted to know what they were like indoors with their children and their wives. And nobody had done that, and so I did it. And what was so shocking was how those women were producing child after child. They were being maritally raped. The 3 women I talked to were all being maritally raped, except they didn't understand the concept of marital rape. And some of them hated their children, okay? They hated their children, and why would they not? Because of the lives. They were brought over as 15, 16-year-olds from some village, had never had autonomy, and it just made me kind of realize what women who are raped in war zones and then have children, what that must feel like. I mean, you talked about love and hate, but you suddenly ask, this is here and now. In our country, there are women who have those same feelings about maternity. It was a really wake-up piece of writing and research, really. I'm going to open it up to the audience. If you'd like to say who you are and keep your comments and questions relatively short so that we can get a wide... yeah.
Before we do that, can I just ask, in terms of the contributors to the volume, how many of you are here? I can see Ruth. Gail, that's really fantastic. Okay, just so that we know. I mean, I feel like you should come here.
Yeah, come forward.
Ruth and Gail. Because people may well have questions for you. There's a seat here. You can have my seat.
Sit here.
That would be great.
Hi, I just missed your chapter.
Brilliant.
Welcome. Yes.
Hi, my name is Maria Jose Blanco, and I just wanted to make a comment on what you just said, because just a few doors away is the Anna Freud Center, and they do work with perinatal, some mothers who have been raped in war zones especially, and because of course that child is not only the father's child, it's also the mother's child.
Yes.
And that is very important to actually make the woman realize who they are bringing.
Okay.
So they are able to actually love their children when they are worked with during pregnancy, before the child is born.
Okay, interesting. Any other? There's a lady there.
Hello. Do you want me to say where I'm from? Yeah, I work at the University of East London. I was interested in your book in terms of the European perspective, because a lot of the work that's been done recently in family studies and mother studies, as you mentioned, is looking at the issue of neoliberalism. And because of that, because neoliberalism tends to be more perhaps intensely embedded in Anglo-American cultures, it hasn't looked at continental Europe quite so much. So I was interested to think about what perspectives came from, going a bit wider and looking at European cultures, and what sort of commonalities and differences you found in ideologies around motherhood, particularly in the last sort of 10, 15 years.
Thank you. We'll need the mic back here, I think. Emily, you've done the German.
That's such a huge. I sort of want to say read the book. But also, Ruth, I'm kind of tempted to hand the mic to you because
I could say a couple of words.
Yeah,
you first.
but because it did come up in Ruth's chapter precisely in a sentence, and then Ruth and I corresponded on this. But it was mainly me saying that's really interesting. I sort of want you to take it further, but we couldn't. The word count was already out of control at that point. But I mean, I kind of wedged it into the introduction a little bit as well by referring mainly to Alison Phipps, whose work is really significant, of course, on neoliberalism. And it's something that I continue in my forthcoming book, sorry, plug. And I do relate the Anglo-American to the German context, actually, in that forthcoming book, where I look at young women, actually girls and young women. But in terms of the volume as a whole, I'm having to rapidly kind of go through the chapters in my mind. I would say probably read it and see if you can extract from it, from individual chapters, what the take-home message is regarding neoliberalism in Europe today. It's probably a bit too large and indigestible a question for me, really, except I would say that probably Ruth's chapter on that French novella, which I've already mentioned, I think it really is, there are many excellent, fine chapters, but that for me is a really fine chapter. And it is also really germane to the volume's aims as a whole. But I will now hand over to Ruth, if I may, because I know you've also worked on neoliberalism and mothering.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you do, is it really only the Anglo world?
That's what I was about to say now. Sorry, hi everyone. Shall I stand up actually? I'm by no means an expert on European literature, and it's English literature plus law that I come from, but what we did discuss, Emily and I, briefly, in regard to my chapter, is that I felt reading the other entries and some of the, say, Italian and French novels that I've read, there seems to be more latitude in the non-Anglo neoliberal countries for maternal rebellion. So, for instance, losing Eugenio, a mother who is able to sort of articulate feelings of sort of ambivalence towards a child in a way that you much more rarely see in English literature, outside of, interestingly, the crime genre, which is something else I've written about in Roberta's volume. Roberta edited a volume on neoliberalism and parenting of the family.
It was more Anglo-American focus, which is why I was interested in the European perspective. And what I sort of assumed is because perhaps the social democratic project has continued more in certain European cultures, you wouldn't have this very individualistic sort of fetishization of the child, consumerist mode of motherhood.
No,
that
doesn't need to be so much.
Feminist writers in America and Britain have talked about so much.
And yeah, Emily mentioned the novella by Véronique Olmy of Baudelaire, and I was initially contacted by an American publisher, I mentioned this in the chapter, who said, will you please review this for me or talk about it because nobody will touch it in America. Because it was considered too shocking, the concept of a mother who could kill. And it isn't like that doesn't happen in the Anglo-neoliberal countries. In fact, it happens at a slightly higher rate in those countries. So there's a level of denial going on here, I believe, far too big, as Emily has said, to really, you would need an entire volume, really, to make these comparisons with you. Yeah.
You've got something to say about the French
you wanted to talk about that because you also talked about that book, didn't you? That Olmy, do you remember?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't have anything particular to say about the rollout of neoliberalism, particularly in the European context, which is what you're talking about, other than just to note that each European country has a very different history of feminism. And so I suppose in terms of a resource that may help to think through the impact of the particular ways that neoliberalism is taking hold in each European country, I guess that would be worth thinking about. In Germany it's very particular, in France it's very particular. And I suppose so that might be a way to think about a coupling or a duality of the development of feminist thought alongside the development of a particular kind of neoliberal. You want me to talk about the Baudelaire?
That's the book.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is a book about a mother who kills her children. I mean, one of the founding myths of Western culture is Medea, a mother who kills her children. It's hardly a kind of new issue, but it seems that in that book something very, very despairing gets communicated about a psychic state that a woman gets into, which some people have talked about in terms of ambivalence, and I guess I wouldn't think about in terms of ambivalence. I would think about actually in terms of something beyond ambivalence. In fact, something closer to what we could call potentially, I guess, the death drive, where ambivalence has failed, where the holding together of love and hate has collapsed, actually. And so in the absence of the capacity to have an ambivalent feeling towards a child, that's when you're in another kind of psychic terrain. And I think that is why that book is, in a way, so shocking, is that it actually opens up the issue of the collapse of ambivalence. And it's been talked about, I think, wrongly in terms of, oh goodness, isn't it amazing that mothers also hate their children as well as love them? Well, absolutely we know that, and we know that at all sorts of levels. But I think it's very hard to think about what happens when ambivalence collapses, both as a psychic state and also, I guess, potentially as a social issue. What are the conditions in which that occurs?
And it must occur a lot, because you see some child abuse cases, and that's exactly the question. That Carolyn, I think I'm not making this up. But was it Rachael Hook who wrote Cusk? Thank you. And I remember her being treated like a witch by reviewers, and that wasn't even about violence. It was just a very honest. So it's still quite difficult, isn't it, to communicate. Beautiful writer. She did it in such an extraordinary way, but the reaction from other women.
Yeah, it was really shocking, actually, and I really had to read the book several times to try and figure out what on earth the problem was. I thought it was just very honest. But again, I think there is something in this idea of a woman daring to sort of define her own motherhood and to be less than, overwhelmingly happy about it, and to also shirk that packaging, if you like, in terms of how we package women's literature about motherhood. Because so often the mediatisation of mothers is done by, a sort of male subjectivity that portraiture of the maternal is not coming from an actual lived experience sometimes. So I think that was my take on why the response was as it was. But I think there's all kinds of contexts at play.
A last question before we end. There's
Is there a space in the book for the concept of a woman mothering a child who is not her child?
Yes.
Lots.
Yeah. There is. Sorry. Yes. There is. Perhaps you'd like to talk about. Would you mind? Would you mind saying that? That would be fantastic. Just introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Gail. I've spent my whole career researching women who are mothers and women who aren't mothers, and quite a lot of the people I've talked to have either felt stigmatised because they aren't mothers or stigmatised because they are. So I spent quite a lot of years researching involuntary childlessness, and then I've spent quite a lot of years researching teenage parenthood. So it was like the two ends of the spectrum, really. So I've been really concerned and interested to explore the different ways in which women might be maternal, which sometimes is in social relationships, but sometimes is in relationships not at all with children. And quite a lot of my work has been autobiographical. And it's very recently, and it is interesting because, again, the whole of my career, I was really interested in what you were saying about the need to talk together as mothers and non-mothers. But I would say, both within the academy and outside of it, I've quite often been told that I don't have the status or the experience to talk about mothering because I'm not a biological mother. Again and again and again. And it's happened to me just recently too, so it's happened a lot. And I think that's one of the problems, that we're still having that tension where some people are allowed to speak and some people aren't allowed to speak. And it's really very, recently I've come to I write about this a bit in the chapter, I think. I've come to an interesting realisation about the importance of my relationship with my mum, which was always very important, but has come to mean different things to me since she died. And I was thinking about the status of being able to write about being mothered, as well as the status of being able to write about mothering or non-mothering. And basically I think it's all very, very complex. And we need to keep recognising the complexity in all of those different stories, really.
Thank you. I mean, Christina Patterson, my colleague we used to work at The Independent, has written very movingly about not being a mother and in the present time. So thank you all. There's so much to think about and so much. All I remember is when my son was born, and I was too young to be a mom then. This was the dungaree baby. And one night we didn't have plastic bottles, and he was crying. And I just threw this bottle down and walked barefoot on glass. I shall never forget that. Never forget that. Thank you so much. The book's for sale. We're here till 9. You can talk to the authors, the editors, and exchange experiences downstairs, please. And thank you all for coming. Bye.